Hi, I'm Dr. Shiloh.
And I'm Dr. Scott.
And this is LA Not So Confidential, the forensic psychology and true crime podcast.
Each episode, we explore the intersection of psychology, the criminal justice system, and entertainment.
Today, our episode is on the forensic psych topic of Piquerism.
Hey folks, welcome back. And just a reminder that we made a big announcement about wrapping up the show coming up soon in October of 2025. And yeah, it feels a bit surreal to have it out there after 8 years, but we are still excited for the material that's coming out in the next 2.5 months, as well as our legacy, right?
Yeah, definitely. And we just wanted to say with the announcement, your sweet messages and emails are still coming in, obviously, as people catch up too. And they are just absolutely warming our hearts. And we're so grateful for the new listeners who are coming in and that continue to subscribe each month. We just wanted to just say thank you, even if we haven't responded to every email or DM or what have you. I've had some in person. I ran into some people at a training this week that were like, what? I haven't gotten to that yet. I'm a few weeks behind, and delivered the news in person, and just some lovely feedback that we would have never gotten. So we also want to thank everyone for another great walking tour in July. It was a blast. Even though you and I have done that tour multiple times now, it just, one, Chris is amazing.
Yeah.
Just, you can't get any better than that. But obviously being with a new group of people and old friends makes it that much more special. So with our last episode, the forensic psych one was episode 210, and that was titled Echoes of Salem, Modern Witch Hunts and the Courts. This one hit a lot of topics, a lot of cases that involve moral panic and politically charged moves in the criminal justice system that has fortunately moved somewhat in the right direction, but as we found out in that episode, is still very susceptible to a backslide from time to time.
Episode 211 was a conversation with our wonderful best friends, criminologist Dr. Amy Schlossberg and Dr. Megan Sachs, about how media intersects with, motivates, and fuels crime in this day and age. And then we dropped you a bonus episode of our chat with retired FBI Special Agent Catherine Schweit about her new book, Women Who Talk to the Dead. This book tells a remarkable story of two female investigators who set out to give names to the nameless victims buried in Potter's Field.
Well, this feels full circle in a way, back to our roots of topics here.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can't go too long without talking about paraphilia. You know that. Yeah. But yeah, we're circling back to this topic of sexual paraphilias and offending behaviors, which is representative of that heavenly cesspool of an internship where we met. Those were the days.
Oh, so long ago. And so long ago that I can now be a lot more frank with some of the things that we experience, which are hilarious and gross. You know what? We have to talk about these more in our shrink wraps. We really we're going to keep generating shrink wraps off and on. But I have 2 words for you: shared bathroom, hand lotion.
Oh my God.
There you go. That's not 2 words. Those are 2 descriptors, but bathroom and hand lotion will tell a story, you folks. It's like so hilarious and so gross.
And tell me, again, this is like inside. Right. Sorry, everyone. But tell me you didn't think exactly of that when we were on our tour and he was talking about the Jergens hand lotion factory.
Yes.
Okay.
Chris of CLA in a Day has a connection to like a Jergens factory. Okay, so we're going to leave it at that. But promo for CLA in a Day when you can, folks.
For sure.
So anyway, back to our topic for today. This specific paraphilia called Piquerism has been on our list of topics to cover for a while now. And it's sort of making the rounds again recently with the resolution of the Idaho 4 case in the past month or so. And we're going to have a separate conversation in a shrink wrap and probably a behind the couch in the next couple of months. But let's get into the research before we explore that particular area to see if it even fits into this incident or not. So trigger warnings, as usual, we're going to be talking about sexual offending themes, murder, especially with edged weapons and stabbing. This is a dark one, folks. Yeah. So again, we all know the stats on trigger warnings, that they apparently don't do anything, but we care about you and we want you to care about yourself. So be careful and have that pause button ready if it gets too descriptive for you.
Yeah, definitely. And we will have another trigger warning towards the end today, just because we're going to be a little bit more descriptive in a case that we want to do a little bit of banter and analysis on. But with that, when people are asked to imagine the most terrifying way to die. One method that comes up again and again is being stabbed, and it's not hard to understand why. I mean, stabbing is very up close and personal. It's brutally intimate and deeply violent. Unlike a gunshot, which can happen at a distance and be over in an instant, a stabbing really forces the victim into intimate contact with their attacker. It's face to face. There's no space, no time, no chance to mentally prepare in a lot of cases. And victims often see the weapon, feel repeated thrusts, and are overwhelmed by really the sheer physicality of it all. This type of violence feels very chaotic, it's raw, it's emotional, and that really taps into a lot of our most primal fears. And research backs this up. In surveys, people rank stabbing along with burning and drowning among the most feared forms of death. A UK study even found it was second to only being shot at by close range.
So, why is it so high on the fear scale? It's the suffering, whether real or imagined. And most people believe, rightly so, that being stabbed is painful, it's slow, it's messy. Even a fatal wound may not cause immediate unconsciousness. And so, of course, there's psychological trauma right there. You're sitting with the reality of this action that can take you out quickly or slowly. So that's really big. It's massive. Survivors of knife attacks frequently describe the sensation of helplessness, panic, disbelief that such a violent thing is actually happening to them. And then there's also what stabbing often represents: rage, control, and intimate betrayal. It's not uncommon in domestic violence cases where the emotions are really high and the weapon is like whatever's closest, which is often a kitchen knife. Just picture any horror movie in the last 30 years, right? Unlike shooting, stabbing requires repeated action. And then that is often driven by complete dumps of adrenaline into the system or just raw emotion. It's not just about killing, it's about this unrelenting domination or punishment.
And in terms of forensic considerations, this is where behaviors like overkill come into play. When we're looking at dozens of stab wounds, that tells us something about the killer, perhaps about the motive, and sometimes about the relationship to the victim. So yes, people fear being stabbed, and for really good reason. It's why later in our entertainment section, why movies play on this over and over and over again. It's a form of violence that's not only deadly and painful, but it really shows the most horrifying side of what humans are capable of.
Piquerism, however, is a form of sexual sadism and a paraphilic disorder that's characterized by a sexual fixation on penetrating another person's skin with sharp objects such as needles, knives, or other instruments. And the goal there is achieving intense sexual arousal or sexual gratification. So this compulsion often involves targeting specific areas like the breasts, the buttocks, the groin, and it's generally accompanied by arousal from the victim's pain, fear, or their physical reaction. In extreme cases, the acts may cause serious injury or death. So the theory here is that the behavior symbolically mirrors sexual penetration, making it a violent and pathological expression of both dominance and sexual desire. And the term Piquerism was coined in the 1920s by Wilhelm Steichel. However, it was explored prior to that back in 1886 when he had written about the concept with this particular statement, quote, "When the injury of the victim of lust and sight of the victim's blood are a delight and pleasure." So Krafft-Ebing expanded in his 1965 seminal work, Psychopathia Sexualis, by stating that sexual gratification is not achieved through rape or sexual assault, but rather by aspects of the murder itself. And he states, where sexual violation is omitted and the sadistic crime alone becomes the equivalent of coitus.
Just in case this is anyone's first time listening to us cover a paraphilia or a paraphilic disorder, let's just quickly review that criteria. So generally, a paraphilia involves sexual arousal to deviant or bizarre images or activities. Deviant in this case, meaning it tends to be harmful or involving a non-consenting partner. And often it's criminal if it is acted upon. Or in the case of the bizarreness, meaning there is sort of a rare theme to it statistically, that it's generally something we don't find when we're looking at the wide variety of people's sexual interests. These intense urges have to last for at least 6 months. So we're not just talking about one fleeting thought of something bizarre or weird or rare. And it needs to cause significant distress to the person's life. So this can be psychologically, this could be interpersonally, maybe occupationally, or just in a myriad of other ways that it is now interrupting and being distressful to them. Multiple paraphilia can be present with one person. And as a lot of you have heard us say before, they actually often travel in threes, but there is going to be a dominant one. And sometimes dominant doesn't mean that like it's the strongest, but it might just be the one that they have thus far acted out on and may continue to act out on the others. But usually it's the one that brings attention to them or they get arrested for it or something like that. So fantasy is also a key component to paraphilias. Before any acting out, there are intense urges and fantasies that are utilized as arousal material for masturbation. And then there might be some planning or rehearsal stages that are attempts to sort of satiate the urge before any acting out happens, especially if it's something that's illegal or going to cause harm. And if that person is afraid of those things, AKA actually has a conscience and maybe is not fully psychopathic, they might do some of those things, sort of in lieu of to see if it helps satiate the urges. And while we really can't talk about a violent paraphilia such as Piquerism without mentioning the obvious overlap with sexual sadism, we just wanted to mention that here. Sexual sadism disorder is one of the main paraphilic disorders listed in the DSM, and it is characterized by taking sexual pleasure from humiliation, fear, or another form of mental harm to a person. So sadistic acts include restraint, such as ropes, chains, handcuffs, as well as imprisonment, as well as behaviors against that person in terms of causing harm that could be biting, whipping, beating. Of course, can these acts be consensual? Yes. And in those cases, there is not likely any distress being caused that can't be resolved as people kind of find their way into that lifestyle safely. So, in fact, many who engage in BDSM or kink within the context of romantic relationships report that it actually brings them closer to their partners. And this is, mainly due to these increased feelings of trust that result from setting and respecting boundaries, as well as the emotional safety that comes from being able to explore some of these less conventional sexual interests without judgment. So we just wanted to make sure we got that in here to not pathologize these behaviors that are being utilized safely.
Clearly, because consent and good judgment are just key to healthy sexuality. But when someone repeatedly practices these type of sadistic sexual acts without consent from their partners, or when sadistic fantasies or behaviors cause social, professional, or other functional problems within an individual's life, sexual sadism disorder may be diagnosed. And when we look at the broader population of sexual offenders, only about 2 to 5% of them would actually meet criteria for sexual sadism. And the majority, which is 87%, of sexual sadists who do offend do so against other adults. Very important to remember. So when combined with traits of antisocial personality disorder like poor impulse control, dishonesty, lack of empathy, and remorse, sexual sadism can especially be dangerous. Some researchers like to distinguish between sex murders and lust murders. So let's break down those two terms, wherein sex murderers kill their victims to silence them out of fear of being caught or retribution, right? And then lust murderers kill as part of the completion of the sexual fantasy. A lust murder may perform various sexual acts before, during, and after the victim is killed, and the rape being just one of the part of the sexual ritual or acting out.
Right. So typologies of serial sexual murders include visionary. So this is where there is psychosis and perhaps command hallucinations on board. We also have mission oriented. So they believe it is their mission to rid society of certain groups of people. We also have hedonistic. These are your thrill seekers who derive satisfaction from the kill itself. And then the power and control typology, where the primary source of pleasure is the killer's ability to control and exert power over a helpless victim. Some of the cognitive distortions of sexual sadists include justifications that they tell themselves, like, this person is bad, this person is evil, sick, or perverted. They are deserving this. That's definitely some mental gymnastics. Okay, now that we laid that foundation, let's get back on track to explore Piquerism specifically. There's not the data on Piquerism that there is with other more well-researched type of paraphilic disorders, but you might come to expect that with something that is more rare. So yeah, I guess there's not that much. There was actually more than I thought there was going to be. Hence the
Okay.
reason there's an entire episode. It was good enough to formulate a full episode. And I think you guys will find that this is really interesting. And, where this can go even further is still definitely to be explored. In that, I was able to find an entire book chapter on the subject by Dr. DeVere D. Woods, a former police officer who became a criminologist. I was like, who is this guy? I need to look him up. He ended up advancing to the position of criminology department chair at Indiana State University by the time he had authored this chapter, which is pretty cool.
And it's very important to note here, this book is 20 years old. However, Dr. Woods' background is really important in this particular chapter that we're utilizing, because as someone who was once a crime scene investigator, as a sworn officer, and then a criminologist, you can really feel how much importance he puts on interpreting crime scene artifacts and the wounds to the victim. So he advocates that it's not enough for an investigator to just shake their head at the excessive amounts of wounds and talk about how senseless it seems, but to actually take the time to try and understand the motivation for those mutilating wounds, which in turn could eventually assist in identifying the perpetrator.
So what he's really focused on in this book chapter is Piquerism as a signature behavior. Gosh, this really feels like we're hitting all the greatest hits of, forensic psych topics that people love. It's really going back to that notion of MO versus signature behaviors during the time that the crime is being committed. So investigators have been trained over the years to consider modus operandi, or MO, the MO being the perpetrator's method of operation, right? What crimes do they engage in and how do they go about accomplishing them? So while each MO is unique in its details, it usually falls within a typical range of behaviors for a specific type of crime. That means while sort of the small stuff, the small actions might vary, the overall approach to the crime tends to be pretty consistent, especially across similar type crimes, right? So property crimes, crimes against people, thefts, that sort of thing. Investigators use these patterns not only to link crimes together, but to also connect them to potential suspects. Now, think of an MO like a criminal's craftsmanship, right? It can reflect the offender's personal habits and preferences, or even the level of experience that they are bringing to the table. In fact, the MO is often based on what has worked for them in the past. If a certain method gets the result that they want and lets them get away with it, they're likely going to use it again.
So most experts agree that a criminal's MO stays fairly stable over time. And that might be due to superstition or a lack of creativity. But others who examined MOs believe that consistency has more to do with human nature, because we tend to repeat behavior that has been successful. I mean, that's just sort of Occam's razor. It's the most sensible understanding for a conundrum like that, right? But here's the important part. MOs can and do evolve. And as offenders gain experience, they adapt. They learn what works better, what's more efficient, or even how to throw off law enforcement. And that is really a phenomenon in today's world with the advent of forensics files.
Right.
Forensics files has now been on for decades and newer versions, and it really does become sort of like a primer learning environment for criminals. Like, oh, I got to watch for that particular thing. Got to make sure I wear a mask and gloves, right? So these techniques in these perpetrators might shift based on trial and error, or because they're trying to be more emotionally satisfied or just to avoid getting caught. And so that evolution can continue across their entire criminal career, especially as circumstances change. For example, if their motive or opportunity shifts, then their approach might shift as well. No two crimes are committed under exactly the same conditions, and that affects the way the crime is carried out. Now, it's also worth noting that most investigators won't ever encounter a true serial homicide case, despite all the shows that are on that, like, just sort
Yeah,
of there's a serial killer on every corner, right? So those investigators may naturally treat each incident as a one off. Without clear signs that the crimes are connected, it can be easy to miss the larger pattern.
definitely. So Dr. Woods notes that, quote, while the MO reflects the perpetrator's creativity and experience, a signature reflects his personality, end quote. So in other words, a signature is the thing the perpetrator does to make the crime meaningful to him. FBI profiler John Douglas added that it's what gives the perpetrator, quote, emotional satisfaction. Dr. Eric Hickey, who was the dean of my graduate program, noted in his
Oh,
book on serial killers that signatures are the offender's calling card and that he is psychologically compelled to leave this behind. It's not the means he uses to complete the offense, but it's this calling card aspect. Dr. Hickey added, quote, signatures include verbal, sexual, and physical acts. Therefore, the signature is essential to the perpetrator's satisfaction of the crime. Additional researchers have also come to the determination that unlike MO, a killer's signature is fairly consistent or static because it's based in the perpetrator's fantasies. So it is much more difficult for him to change his signature than his MO. Douglas, Brandel, and Keppel have all determined that the psychological core of the signature really does not change, but it could evolve over time. Signatures are especially important to consider in murders perpetrated by serial offenders. Wood states that he considers signature killers as a subcategory of serial killers who leave these unusual pieces of evidence of their psychological makeup at the crime scene. And therefore, giving emphasis to signatures is especially helpful in behavioral profiling and serial linkage of crimes.
signature killers can perform bizarre or symbolic behaviors like posing the body, inserting foreign objects, or taking souvenirs from the victim. And in some rare cases, fewer than 1% of these types of murders, these acts involve specific forms of sexual activity with the deceased, which can offer really profound insights into that particular offender's fantasy life. And detectives who recognize and understand these signatures often have a better chance at connecting cases and then catching the serial offenders as compared to those who rely solely on traditional investigative techniques. It seems like a lot of the more dramatic criminal procedural shows love the idea of these signature killers despite their low statistical occurrence. So, note what we're saying here. Yes, there's a low occurrence of this happening, but we also need to emphasize that there needs to be somebody that's willing to look at the big picture to pick up on these factors. Not all homicides are created equal, especially those where knives are involved. In many serial murders, the act itself is surprisingly quick, often fueled by adrenaline, impulsivity, and many times in today's world, substance use. Novice offenders can often be really shocked at how easily a blade can end a life, or they can also be frustrated about how resilient and fighting back a victim can offer, right? Requiring multiple utilitarian strikes. These wounds are functional, intended solely to kill and nothing more. Once death is achieved, the act is then complete. And this is so important for investigators because, as Bricken and his compatriots' research from 2006 indicate, as paraphilic offenders, those who are sexually aroused by the infliction of this behavior upon others, a single Piquerist homicide is most likely to be followed by others.
I know we're laying a lot of foundation. I promise you guys we are going to narrow in on Piquerism in a moment, but this is all really necessary, especially when it comes to some case analysis. And we also, if you go back into our resources, there are wonderful studies that just do case analysis for Piquerism that you guys can go on to read as well. But then there are killings that go far beyond what's necessary to end a life, right? So in cases of overkill, the number of stab wounds, sometimes dozens or even over 100, far exceed what is needed to end a life. This level of violence is not only physically demanding, but I think really psychologically revealing as well. It signals that something deeper is at play here. The killer isn't just trying to extinguish life, they are expressing rage, loss of control, or an intense emotional drive that extends beyond the act of murder itself. Research and case studies suggest that stabbing requires greater emotional investment than gun usage. The act, as we've said before, is more physically intimate, which may reflect deeper psychological motivations, again, on that spectrum of anger and rage and revenge, or sexualized violence in some offenders, and as we're kind of talking about today. Before we talk more about overkill, just a little bit more on murders perpetrated with knives. Stats from the US indicate that knife homicides are more likely to occur between people who know each other, family members, intimate partners, or acquaintances, as compared to gun-related killings, which more frequently involve strangers or are associated with gang activity. A significant portion of knife homicides are linked to domestic violence. And in these cases, the weapon is often just readily available in the home, used impulsively during a heated conflict. Most knife homicide offenders are male, and the incidents often involve alcohol or drug use. So while firearm homicides have spiked in recent years, knife-related killings have remained relatively stable in the US.
Let's talk about overkill in these cases, which is notable when stabbing is involved, but it's not necessarily compatible with Piquerism. So, overkill refers to the excessive and repeated infliction of injuries, so extreme that the actual act of murder almost becomes secondary to the violence itself. These aren't just wounds necessary to cause death, hence the link to the signature of the crime, as we spoke about earlier. These are wounds that go far beyond. They're often involving multiple methods of killing or such intense trauma that the victim is virtually unrecognizable. So, what drives this kind of brutality? And in many cases, the killer doesn't stop after the victim is dead. Researchers Spitz, Ressler, and Keppel have written extensively on how the violence continues, sometimes until the killer feels a sense of control or reassurance about their own power. This is especially evident when the face is targeted. They suggest that excessive injuries to the face often signal a deep personal rage. It's not just about ending a life, it's about erasing an identity. Destroying the face means destroying the person, psychologically dehumanizing them.
Sometimes this can also suggest a prior relationship. The victim might have been someone the killer knew intimately, or perhaps symbolized someone from the killer's past. In that way, the crime becomes more than just murder, right? It becomes almost this emotional obliteration of this person. Overkill is especially notable in cases with strong emotional underpinnings, such as jealousy or betrayal. Overkill then becomes a psychological fingerprint in this case. It tells investigators and forensic psychologists not just how someone was killed, but perhaps why. And often that why then reveals this complete storm of rage and resentment and unresolved trauma. And just a note from the research. So back in 1992, Robert Ressler and his colleagues at the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit found evidence of mutilation and overkill in many of the sexual homicides that they collected data on for their bodies of work, including Ressler's book, Whoever Fights Monsters, which I'm sure many of you have read. So, I know we referenced Dr. Wood's chapter being from 20 years ago. A lot of the foundational work to what we're talking about today is back from those early BAU days. So yeah, we're talking like 1992 is where some of this is also coming from. However, in some of the literature, you will see a term adopted from the media's coverage of such crimes when it comes to overkill behaviors with knives. And that is, they use the term Ripper murders. Not my favorite term that they've ever come up with. These killings are in the context of homicide that involve a knife or a similar sharp instrument and the infliction of numerous excessive stabbing or slashing wounds to the victim, and have been reported all around the world. So UK, Russia, Caribbean, China, and the US. The term, although we don't love it, it comes from the media. It is represented in the literature, some of these academic articles, and some of the research that focuses on Ripper murders includes not only behaviors with dozens of stab wounds, But they've also gone a little further and looked at completed or attempted decapitations in some cases, and then also disembowelment, which have been just ways in which bodies have been additionally desecrated with sharp-edged weapons.
So back when Dr. Wood's book chapter was written 20 years ago, Piquerism was just emerging as a concept from these landmark efforts to profile serial murder crime scenes. And again, Piquerism is essentially the cutting and stabbing for sexual pleasure. Dr. Eric Hickey notes that the piquer, in most cases, achieves sexual orgasm by stabbing his victim. Keppel and Burns took this a step further and opined that even though it sounds contradictory, Piquerism behaviors are acts to achieve satisfaction, not to cause death. Of course, death is often the result. And if we go all the way back to good old Dr. Freud, well, of course, he wasn't shy to bring up the phallic nature of edged weapons, and this continues to be an important part of the conversation about the psychology of the piquerist. If we look at this Venn diagram, there is the sexual sadism element, the power and control element, perhaps with specific rage or jealousy, and then the penetrative nature of using the knife to symbolize a violent sexual act. These 3 points are really vital in their overlap to understand.
So essentially, penile satisfaction is transferred to the cutting instrument. And in some cases, researchers believe that mutilation can be somewhat of, I'm using heavy air quotes here, foreplay to the killer's sexual gratification. There have even been cases where the offender was unable to perform sexually, then stabs the victim. The penetrative power, again, sort of manifesting itself in the knife in this case. There are other examples where the relationship between the knife and the penis is one of mutual exclusivity. For example, in our resources, there was a case study of an offender who had actually started interfacing with his victim, became aroused, and was kind of confused by this, and then couldn't decide how he was then going to move forward with killing her. The same offender in another one of his crimes ended up masturbating over a victim after striking her with a hammer, not using any penetrative object at all. He didn't use a knife in this case. So when these cases are really examined closely, it's not so black and white. And again, I think this speaks to the evolution of MO, especially when, with victims, you're talking about another person that could throw off, whatever the best laid plan is. So we do see these big differences, and it can be really subtle to link some of these together and even go a step further to say, this is piquerism at work here. Keppel and Burns noted that for some killers, it no longer matters if the victim is still alive. The perpetrator's sexual urges can be expressed in postmortem mutilation and other types of cutting exploration. There have even been cases where some killers return to the crime scene to derive further satisfaction by inflicting more cutting on their victims' bodies.
Therefore, identifying piquerism from a single stab wound is highly challenging unless the offender describes the intent and their sexual motivations for the act. Investigators instead should be relying on observing patterns, such as the number, the placement, and the grouping of stab or mutilation wounds, and use this information to determine whether or not an attack reflects piquerist behavior. Although piquerism often targets sexual or intimate areas, a high volume of wounds or wounds to other regions may obscure this intent. So investigators have to acknowledge that both piquerism and overkill involve mutilation, but they stem from different motivations. Again, overkill is driven by intense emotional release, typically rage or frustration, and results in excessive chaotic violence meant to obliterate the victim. In contrast, piquerism is controlled and deliberate, with wounds serving as a means of sexual gratification. The injuries, often focused on erogenous zones, may then be patterned and inflicted before or after death. So understanding these distinctions is really essential for accurate behavioral assessment in violent crime. Still, this does not mean that overkill and piquerism are mutually exclusive, and that there does not need to be an insistence that investigators must distinguish between the two. A killer can have pent-up rage and also can connect sexual satisfaction through the violence perpetrated by an edged weapon.
In terms of the crime scene and evidence of obvious sexual activity, which lead to the determination of this being piquerism, it actually might not be so obvious either. Piquerism for some offenders is a key component of achieving sexual gratification, but that gratification doesn't always occur at the crime scene. So in several cases, the mutilation itself kind of serves as that precursor to later arousal. These individuals often leave the crime scene and then engage in their sexual release privately, sometimes hours later, again through fantasy or masturbation, or then it becomes kind of fuel for future fantasy, even as the days and the weeks go by and in between killings if they go on to complete more. As a result, there's often no physical evidence of sexual activity like semen or signs of rape left at the scene. And understanding this delayed connection between violence and gratification is crucial when interpreting certain types of sexually motivated crimes.
So we focused a lot on the investigative portion of the crime scene analysis and the offender motivation, but why is this important for clinicians? Well, accurately identifying piquerism is essential to ensure appropriate treatment planning. In cases involving this particular paraphilic disorder, especially when tied to serious charges like homicide, failing to recognize that there is sexual motivation involved can lead to unmet treatment needs. So, proper identification not only supports individual rehabilitation, but also it then strengthens the case for developing and expanding specialized treatment programs to address paraphilic behaviors like piquerism. So even as rare as it is, it can be treated to some extent, but it has to be noticed, even though it's, like we were saying, very rare, small percentage. Just because it's a low incidence of this particular thing that manifests doesn't mean it's any less important. And in some cases, it may be even more important in the potential for violence. And treatment for paraphilic disorders is complex. I mean, that's just right down to the groundworks, it is complex because it has to be tailored to the individual's risk, their behavior, and their willingness to engage in treatment. Seriously, it's so important. If you can't get engagement, you're not getting anywhere. The focus is going to be not just on suppressing urges, but on building safer and more adaptive behaviors while managing risk to the community and the others around them, right? So treatment has to prioritize public safety. I mean, especially this is what brought Dr. Shiloh and I together, is working in a forensic setting in a clinic where the bigger overarching goal was to protect the community with these people that had a potential for sexual violence against others. But it also, the treatment planning has to emphasize violence risk assessment and that individual's psychological profile. So comprehensive risk assessments are essential. And we as clinicians have to consistently and continually evaluate for co-occurring mental health conditions, because it is very rare that any of these things exist completely in a vacuum. There may be the presence of other paraphilias, and whether the individual's urges after completion are distressing or gratifying, either prodromal leading up to it or post-act. And when I say co-occurring, I want to really primarily emphasize the presence of psychosis, because that is a whole different bubble out there. This is not a psychopath. This is not a pure antisocial. This is not a rage killing. Psychosis is on a whole different level of comprehension and understanding and treatment planning, right? Now, another one that is very predominant in today's world is the comorbid existence of serious addiction, particularly with substances like amphetamine and methamphetamine. And that can cause non-organic psychotic episodes with like serious chronic use. Time and time again, we will get exposed to information about crimes that occurred almost out of nowhere, where, you know, the background on the perpetrator is, this is not the person I knew, they're good people, but she's a meth addict or he's a meth addict and they've been on a 6-month run, because that is how powerful and destructive those medications, they literally can change the wiring in the brain after that much exposure. So going back to the output of treatment, it can involve cognitive behavioral therapy that focuses on deviant arousal, impulse control, and really importantly, relapse prevention. along with possible use of anti-androgen medication or even SSRIs to reduce sexual preoccupation. Although, look, just very clearly here for anyone listening now or 10 years in the future, medications are not a singular option. It gets promoted in the media. It gets promoted by, I will say even this, I'll just go out, smaller law enforcement agencies that are not quite so up to the latest research will say, let's chemically castrate them and that's going to fix everything. It really doesn't. And of course, there are legal considerations like mandated reporting and treatment within specified forensic or secure settings, such as the ones that Dr. Shiloh and I worked in.
Yeah, for sure. Just to go back to your point about co-occurring disorders and sort of weeding those out, I'll give a very quick, brief example. One of the sexual sadists I worked with was a female sex offender. And, she was coming out of prison and coming back into the community. And when she had committed her offenses, had been under the influence of meth and had quite a serious addiction problem. But as we're going through this, I'm thinking like good clinical interviewing is so important because we then were able to go back before she had even acted out and before she was under the influence of drugs. And there were still those fantasies and urges of sexual sadism prior to all that. So I was able to say, yes, she is a sexual sadist. This wasn't like a result of some methed out craziness.
Right. You got a
But just an
great
example.
history. You went in depth and got all that information.
Yeah, it's looking at timing of things, which can be really muddy, especially if you have a bad historian giving you the information, or they just don't remember, right? Different times of when things started happening for them.
I was going to jump in too, just briefly. There was another case that was really famous back in the day, and I believe her name, because this is off the cuff, I didn't prepare the note for this for today's outline, but I think it was Carla Faye Tucker in Texas. And she was on like a meth binge with
Oh,
a
yeah.
boyfriend and brutally murdered a couple in their home using an axe, using the point end of an axe, I believe. And she even testified in court that like she was so overwhelmed by the amount of substance that was in her that she got
Yep.
a satisfaction from it. But to my knowledge, there was no history at all of her ever having a history of engaging in sadistic acts. So again,
Yeah.
another testament to just how brutal methamphetamine can wreck a system.
Definitely. And I don't think that I spelled it out when we talked about paraphilia criteria, but I mean, these are really pervasive. I mean, these are sexual interests that have probably been there since
Right.
puberty and adolescence and as, sexual interests are forming. So if the person is not afraid to disclose it or there's not that shame behind it, if the history is there, it should go back pretty far. So just to dial down a little bit on that last point that you made regarding treatment, and this was so much of the work that you and I did in our internship site, what I went on to do for many years, where we're focusing on those whose paraphilia is clearly a factor in their offending behavior. So generally treatment, yes, is going to consist of psychotherapy, primarily cognitive behavioral therapy, where the goal is to help individuals recognize, understand, and then manage those deviant sexual thoughts and behaviors. A lot of the techniques that we relied on heavily were cognitive restructuring. So you're challenging the mental gymnastics, the distorted beliefs about sex, about power, about consent. There's then behavioral interventions. So reducing the deviant arousal through techniques like aversion therapy is something that is definitely used still. Masturbatory satiation is something that is not really used anymore. That's kind of the like, hey, I'm going to have you smoke that whole pack of cigarettes so you don't like cigarettes anymore. Yeah, that's pretty much been ruled out. But what we would do is we would work on building appropriate fantasies for them to then have sexual gratification with. So they didn't go back to the old version, which was deviant or illegal if they were acted out on it. But we could go to something that is still sexually satisfactory, but maybe involving an 18 or 19-year-old rather than someone younger, or not including violence to still get their sexual urges met. And then this all kind of has a through line of relapse prevention, which really comes from addiction methods for working with folks who are trying to remain in recovery and remain sober. And this is, again, all about identifying triggers, finding intervention points, building coping strategies, and looking at all of the factors that come into play to avoid acting on these urges. Lastly, I would say, training is probably a pretty strong word, but like empathy training, trying to build empathy in folks is something that, again, was kind of a through line. And we touched on it as much as possible in treatment, because that's one of those factors. And it for some folks can be there or it cannot. And maybe you can do all the training in the world and those connections aren't being made in the brain.
So there are also some pharmacological treatments, particularly the ones that I was speaking about early. These are used certainly with individuals that are at a high risk of offending or of reoffending. And one of the go-tos is, it's kind of ironic. So a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, an SSRI, or an SNRI, which is a similar medication that works on norepinephrine. These medications are very commonly and very successfully used to treat depression and anxiety in run-of-the-mill treatment for those disorders. Through a psychiatrist, I usually highly recommend that you don't get your psychiatric medications from just a regular family doctor, because they don't have the specialized training that's required. But as a side effect, one of the main side effects for SSRIs is that it's really hard to sometimes even get an erection, and it's very difficult to reach climax. So they found this as a useful tool to reduce obsessive sexual thoughts, compulsivity, and anxiety that are common for cases that are involving voyeurism, exhibitionism, and fetishism. But the word is still out actually on whether or not those consistently work. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. I don't want to say silver bullet cure, but it doesn't work that way. And then, of course, the anti-androgens that lower testosterone levels in order to reduce libido. And those are often used in cases of pedophilic disorder or severe sexual aggression. The problem is with the anti-androgens is that you can lower the testosterone level, so it's going to affect the ability to have an erection, the ability to climax. It doesn't necessarily address the motivational drive if the motivational drive is to hurt other people. So let's just again emphasize that these are not one size fits all approaches. And we know that these drug treatments don't prevent crimes, because sexual crimes can be completed with body parts other than the genitals. Many of you sent us a recent news story out of Italy where they're moving towards legalizing chemical castration for rapist and pedophilic offenders. And God knows, I love Italy. I dream of living there. But that is actually pretty archaic, because it can be effective for those who are also participating in psychotherapy and who want to change and are highly motivated, but it is not a fix by itself. And it feels very odd, because Italy can be really ahead of the game in many medical areas of research, but this is one where I question it.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, many people sent that to us, probably because they've heard us talk about this before.
Right.
They were like, what do you think? Yeah. Another key part to treatment of sexual offending behavior for those with paraphilia or paraphilic disorders is just this multidisciplinary and risk-based approach. So this means treatment involves collaboration among the treating clinicians, psychiatrists, usually that are part of their parole or probation agency, perhaps medical doctors, and the criminal justice professionals like the probation officers and parole agents who are monitoring them. So in these cases, treatment is guided by risk level. So again, doing entire risk assessments, looking at their history and looking at risk level. We're not predicting human behavior, but assessing risk. We also, part of this is motivation and insight of the individual. Again, how engaged are they going to be? Do they want to change? And then, sort of the legal forensic involvement. Is there treatment court mandated at this point? Are there polygraphs going to be used? How often do they have to come? And then what does the clinician actually recommend? Sometimes those can be in conflict with each other, but all of that is what goes into this risk-based approach. In California, we called it the containment model. So we had the clinician, like if you think of it as a triangle with the offender in the middle, at one tip of the triangle, you have the clinician and treatment. At another tip, you have probation or parole, the monitoring. And the last point was, for here in California, was that polygraph. It was kind of that other catch-all piece that helped the monitoring and us to kind of see where this person was at as we were monitoring them in the community.
Okay, so let's kind of wrap up the research here. In conclusion, after looking at all of this fascinating, interesting, but limited research, a few things continue to stand out significantly. Not all offenders who commit overkill are piquerists, and not all piquerists are homicidal. However, an overkill is a common feature in piquerist killings, which can mislead investigators into attributing the violence solely to rage rather than sexual motivation. And because of this, it's critical for investigators to consider the possibility of piquerism in cases of extreme mutilation, especially when the wounds are targeted at sexual organs or accompanied by victim posing, clothing removal, or signs of torture. I know that just sounds like we're just getting so into such wild specific areas, but it's really important to build out a profound body of research to understand a whole host of other types of crimes. It sounds like it's just focusing on one thing, but as anybody who's interested in research understands, it lends to a larger body of understanding of sexual motivations, particularly when it comes to violence, right? So recognizing these patterns can help link cases a lot more efficiently and in the future prevent further victimization. Like Dr. Sade was saying, risk assessment does not promise that you're going to be able to stop something, but it absolutely can make a huge difference in preventing these types of crimes. And for clinicians, understanding that a homicide may have an underlying sexual component, particularly when the offender conceals or can't express it, it's essential for appropriate assessment and treatment planning. I forgot to ask you, I know this is a totally old show, but did you watch The Fall?
Oh, God, one of my favorites.
Okay, it's so good. It's so good. But so good and so unrealistic in some ways. And like in episode one, I mean, if you're thinking way back, it's probably been close to a decade now. Gillian Anderson, I'll literally watch her silently reading a phone book. I think she's just a fascinating
She
actress
is
and she just gets
so
better and
gorgeous.
better and better, right?
She
And
gets
then
more gorgeous
I
too,
know,
like every year.
not fair, not fair. And what's the name of the actor that went on to
Oh,
be
God,
Shades
he's
of
so hot.
Grey? He has like the best beard
Oh,
in The
yeah.
Fall. So, I mean, for anybody who hasn't seen it, I'm sure everybody's listening has seen it. But he plays I think he's a social worker. He's some kind of mental health
Yeah.
clinician,
Yeah.
and he's seen doing. You're introduced to him doing a couples therapy session with a very contentious couple, and he's drawing a pornographic drawing of the woman sitting across from him,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is so ridiculously unrealistic. And the way I'm tying to this to what we just talked about is that, again, it's really important to understand motivations, but it's also important to put this in a bigger framework within the true crime milieu, is that there are some things that really just don't happen. We do have brutal examples of murders like the recent Idaho 4. Like that's just a
Sure.
brutal, horrible issue. And we hopefully with time and research, we'll understand more about that perpetrator's motivations. But the media's creation of these particular characters can be really misleading. And that's why specific, drilled down, microscopic, minutia oriented research is so important. I know that's a wild connection, but it stuck with me as I was reading through this, not because
Mm.
that character in The Fall is a piquerist, but because he's almost like a Superman in a way, as some of these serial killers and offenders are portrayed.
Yeah, for sure. His name is Jamie Dornan. I don't want
Jamie
to just
Dornan.
objectify him. I want to give him a name
Yes, it's
today.
not fair. He's also wildly funny. I've seen him on
Is he?
he's seen
Oh,
him on
the whole
British talk
package.
shows, and he's really funny.
Well, I just again want to note that there are some very good case analyses of specific cases in our resources. So, again, if you'd like to dive into that sort of thing more deeply, you will find those on our website.
Yes. So, for some of the cases to consider for today, when we look at historical accounts of Piquerism, the London Monster is pretty much most often referenced as for one of the earliest documented cases, right?
Yes. And we pulled some of the analysis for this case from Dr. Catherine Watson, who basically has my dream job. She's a historian of forensic medicine and crime in Britain at Oxford University. I'm like,
Just
"Oh, and
don't
your
get me
name's
started.
Dr. Watson? Are you
Yeah.
like real?" But it's funny because there's a YouTube video and we'll link it. She's like, "Hey, couple murder with sex, and people are going to want to know all about it all the time."
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, that is actually a very Freudian statement because
It is.
Freud was all about the drive to live and the drive to destroy, drive to live being
Hmm.
intimately related to the sexual act, and then death being annihilation. I mean, he was high on cocaine, but he came up with some really good ideas. But isn't that interesting? Because she's making a statement about that. But when we link these two things together, we are almost magnetically drawn to it.
Yep.
So, when crimes have these elements, especially with female victims and the absolute bizarre nature of the acts, it's going to get media attention, which is why we still talk about this particular case from the late 1700s. So let me set it up for you. Between 1788 and 1790, London was paralyzed by fear. Dozens of women reported being attacked in the streets by a man who would approach them, shout obscenities, and then stab or prick them, usually in the buttocks or thighs, with sharp instruments like pins, blades, or spikes. These were not just isolated incidents. In total, over 50 attacks were reported, often in public areas like St. James's and the Strand, places where middle and upper class women were out and visible. Sometimes the attacker offered flowers to distract the victims. Other times, he'd slash their clothing without even touching them. There are even reports that aside from using a knife, he would prick women with a spike protruding from his knee. That is some real planning.
That's terrifying. Let's pause there for a second. So, do we think this sounds like Piquerism so far, even though, of course, back in the 1700s, there wasn't really any psychological framework to understand this? What about these types of attacks where they're being stabbed? What do you think?
Okay, I am familiar with this, and there have been some other podcasts, historical podcasts that have talked about this. But, sort of moving away from those particular sets of information based on what we boiled down and presented as an intro today, I would say that yes, it is Piquerism, but it also is clearly some psychosis. And if it's true, if the
Mm,
information I've got is true, I do think that there is psychosis there because of the shouting of obscenities. Now,
interesting.
is the shouting of obscenities a way to distract the victim? It could be.
Hmm.
You could startle someone and they freeze, right? So a defense mechanism that's one of the F's:
Yeah.
fawn, fly, flee, all of that,
Freeze.
right?
Yeah.
So yelling at somebody is going to startle them. I mean, now that could be that. If he did go so far as to have something, mounted on his knee, like a spike, that indicates some real planning.
Yeah.
But the slashing of clothes could also be either impulsive or an expression of him, again, trying to startle people. But I'm leaning towards psychosis. Like, I think
Yeah.
it's like something psychosis and definitely a paraphilia. Like, this person was a repeat offender and he was successful at it. So he was continuing to do it, right?
No, totally. I think the sexual sort of screaming sexual things at them, along with the cursing, kind of gives me pause to think like, okay, this is sexually motivated, as well as slashing of the buttocks and the thighs, which, would have been very scandalous back then. It's not like they have to go straight for the genitalia, considering like the time period. I'm also showing you right now on our screen this crazy illustration
Yeah,
that,
it's
of
wild.
course, everybody was paralyzed by fear as the media was reporting this. And I'll put this up on our social media of their depiction of the London monster running around the streets in the UK back then. But
I'll also comment on that illustration that it's set up frightening and yet sexually tittillating.
totally,
It's meant,
100%.
it definitely meant, and this is something, let me also provide a framework that it's really important to remember that during that time, for a good solid 125 years, there was a lot in so-called modern society that could drive you crazy. I mean, there was exposure to toxic chemicals everywhere, wallpapers,
Yep.
clothing dyes, like were just laden with lead and with arsenic. And
Yep.
what is it? I'm trying to think was it mercury fumes that, like, when we use
Hmm.
the term Mad Hatter,
Hmm. Hmm.
people, Mad Hatter, like makers of hats at that time, did go crazy because the chemicals they used for the felt
Yeah.
would just give them brain damage.
And
So,
in women's makeup back then
oh,
too.
all right.
Horrible things in there.
Oh my God. That even makes me think of this influencer that was on, like, I think it was 2 years ago. And she was, quote unquote, recreating traditional Egyptian eyeshadow. And so
What?
she's on there talking about, yes, it's Cleopatra used ground malachite, and she's shown putting malachite powder on her eyelids. And all these people are screaming, that's poisonous. Like, you can't even put malachite in water and then have it, ingested.
Oh
If you
my
do, you'll
gosh.
poison yourself. So anyway, just another chalk it up to dumb
What?
humans. How are we even alive, right?
Truly.
So anyway, what did follow this was another phenomenon that we covered, a full-blown moral panic. And women during the time for this monster and wearing protective padding under their dresses. Men formed vigilante patrols to protect the streets, and newspapers, media at the time, fed the fire, dubbing this anonymous attacker as the London Monster.
And because he reportedly only attacked young, beautiful, and well dressed women, at one point, women started faking attacks to show that they too were still young and beautiful and desirable. What a just crazy psychological, sociological twist in all of this.
Right. So, well, and that relates to a couple of other cases that we've
Of
talked
course.
about, false victimization, right?
Yes.
So eventually, a man named Reineck Williams, who was a 23-year-old perfume clerk, was arrested and charged after being identified by one of the alleged victims. But here's where it gets murky. The evidence was super shaky, and some historians argue that he was likely wrongfully accused. He professed his innocence throughout the trial, but the attacks stopped after his arrest. And many victims asserted that he did not match the description. Williams was convicted and served 6 years in prison.
So interesting that the legacy of the London Monster lives on in true crime lore. In fact, some historians believe this case helped shape the public psyche in ways that paved the road for the future serial killer narratives like that of the Whitechapel murders, which was almost a century later after the London Monster. So, Dr. Watson, given the caveat that Williams may not even have been the London Monster, I think feels really similarly to us. The sexual language and cursing at the women, paired with the attacks on the buttocks and the legs, lends to the offender possibly having a paraphilic disorder, maybe even consistent with Piquerism. She points out, however, that after his release, Williams got married. He went on to have a family. He never offended again, making it tough to believe that he would have just stopped the behavior without any additional intervention. And of course, one of those interventions being treatment, which they probably didn't know how to treat except to throw some away, or I don't even know if they were doing lobotomies at that time or how they would have done that. But she's like, I don't think it was him.
Yeah. And then how do we not give a little more time to the Whitechapel murders? And this is one of the cases in which the MO and the signature were analyzed quite well by Keppel and Burns in 2005. So for reference, the Whitechapel murders refer to the series of brutal killings that took place in the Whitechapel district of East London between 1888 and 1891. It was a total of 11 women, most of whom were impoverished and struggling with alcohol misuse. They were murdered under very horrific circumstances. The most infamous of these cases are what are referred to as the 5 canonical victims: Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, who were killed between August and November of 1888. These murders were marked by throat slashing, abdominal mutilation, and in some cases, organ removal. The extreme violence and the distinctive pattern of these killings led investigators and the public to believe that they were the work of a single individual, soon dubbed Jack the Ripper, though the killer was never identified. And of course, the case remains one of the most notorious unsolved serial murder investigations in criminal history. Now, after careful case analysis, they characterized Jack the Ripper not as a traditional sexually motivated killer driven by acts like rape, but rather as someone who achieved sexual gratification through a secondary mechanism, specifically that mechanism being stabbing and mutilation. They assert that his use of a knife to penetrate and dominate his victims reflects an eroticized expression of power and control consistent with Piquerism. Their analysis highlights several hallmarks of Piquerist homicide present in the Whitechapel murders: incapacitation and control of victims, overkill injuries, display and posing of the bodies, escalation in violence, and deliberate planning of attacks. They believe that these behaviors suggest that the sexual component of the crimes was embedded in the violence itself, not in the physical sexual contact, aligning the offender's methods with key indicators of piquerism and homicidal behavior.
Okay, we're going to jump way forward to another case and turning to more recent times. In one of the more bizarre and disturbing cases of targeted violence, a man named Johnny Pimentel pleaded guilty to a string of assaults in Fairfax County, Virginia, where he used an X-Acto knife to slash the buttocks of unsuspecting women in public shopping spaces. So the assaults began in early 2011, taking place in retail stores and malls across the county. Pimentel would typically distract his victims by knocking clothing off the racks. And as the women turned or bent down, he would inflict quick, precise slashes to their buttocks, often so subtly that the victims didn't even immediately recognize what had happened. And in total, 9 women were victimized. Many believed that they had simply brushed against a hanger, or maybe they felt a mild pinch. It wasn't until they discovered slashed clothing and, in some cases, bleeding wounds that they realized they had been assaulted. In several instances, it took days or even weeks for victims to connect their experience to the larger pattern of attacks on other women once news of the incidents started to become public. Pimentel was a former day laborer originally from Peru. He was arrested in early 2012 near a shopping mall in Lima, Peru, and then later extradited to the United States. He ultimately pleaded guilty to 4 counts of malicious wounding and 2 counts of unlawful wounding. Though sentenced to 20 years, the judge ended up suspending all but 7 years of that term. And while no victims sustained life-threatening injuries, the attacks, of course, sparked fear and confusion in the community, particularly because of their seemingly random nature and the highly specific targeting of a private part of the body. These assaults raised questions about sexual violence, humiliation, and how quickly calculated attacks like this can escalate if they're left unchecked. So, this one's very different from the serial killer focus of this episode, but I actually think more in common with the London Monster case than not. But I think it can potentially still kind of fit the bill if the simple criteria is met for a paraphilic disorder, which we don't know. We don't have a psych evaluation for this guy or anything. But certainly the behaviors would pique my interest in that sense.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if they ever did any substantive evaluation of him. That's a really fascinating case, especially given this is a person from another culture and from another country. And is there a previous mental health history? It'd be fascinating to know that. Our next case, of course, is a really major one, especially right now, the Idaho 4. And on November 13th, 2022, 4 University of Idaho students were found fatally stabbed an off-campus rental home in Moscow, Idaho. The victims were Kaylee Gonzalez, age 21, Madison Mogan, age 21, Xana Kernodle, age 20, and Ethan Chapin, age 20. All 4 were attacked in the early morning hours while sleeping. The case drew national attention to the brutality of the killings. I remember it like it was literally yesterday. It was so huge. And the lack of an immediate suspect, this just absolutely affected the close-knit nature of this small college town. After an intense investigation, Brian Koberger, a 28-year-old criminology PhD student at nearby Washington State University, was arrested on December 30th, 2022. He was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. Investigators linked him to the crime through a combination of DNA evidence, cell phone records, and surveillance footage. Last month, he pled guilty to all counts to avoid the death penalty.
So again, this is where I want to insert another trigger warning. We're going to talk about some details of the wounds in this case for us to have a little bit of conversation about whether or not, what we think this is. Is it overkill? Is it Piquerism? What have you? So if you want to skip ahead, please do so. All 4 victims were stabbed multiple times, primarily in the chest and upper body. Some most likely while asleep in their beds. At least 1 other was awake when confronted. We are now just starting to get more information, and I'm sure plenty more will probably come out after this episode airs. So please know this is just a moment in time. We're recording this on August 2nd, where some information has started to come out from families or from documents that have been released now that he has been sentenced. So coroner Kathy Mabbutt confirmed that their wounds were extensive, caused by a large, non-serrated fixed blade knife consistent in size and shape with a K-bar knife, though the weapon itself has not been recovered. Ethan Chapin's fatal wounds severed major vessels under his clavicle, so the neck and high chest area. Xana Kernodle endured over 50 stab wounds, many defensive, really indicating a struggle. Her fatal injuries included penetrations to the lung and to the heart, while Kaylee Gonzalez suffered over 20 stab wounds, including injuries to her lung, liver, and again, that clavicle region. Her body was described as being nearly unrecognizable. There was so much injury. Madison Mogan sustained similar injuries, again, to lungs, liver, and was found with the knife sheath beside her bed, which later it was determined that that's where Kohberger's DNA was found. So there were no signs of sexual assault. Victims were neither tied, gagged, or bound in any way. The scene showed significant blood spatter and cast-off patterns, especially in the rooms where the bodies were found. The wounds were extensive and brutal, with signs of struggle in at least 2 of the cases. And there was no evidence that indicated a sexual motive, no signs of assault. Again, binding was not there, groping, or any indications of masturbatory behavior at the scene. So with that, that is the end of, the description of the wounds there. What do we think? What do we think about overkill? Let's just talk about overkill at first. Scott, thoughts?
I have a number of thoughts, and I want to be very clear here that while both of us are subject matter experts in a lot of areas related and in forensic psychology, like we have some real specialized training, this is just an opinion based on, I would still say, very limited information. And I guess the problem I have with overkill, it's brutal. It's just absolutely brutal. And my heart goes out to the families as we even discuss this. But when we talk about overkill, my question is, did he anticipate the situation he was walking into?
Sure.
Here it is what I'm doing is I'm leaning towards intent. There is the possibility that he absolutely intended to go in and just create a massacre that he thought he would be able to cover for, because he made some rudimentary and very poorly planned efforts to cover his tracks. They were really poorly done.
Yeah, because he's a fucking idiot. He's not a genius.
Yeah. And he's certainly not the genius that he thinks he is. And he really thinks highly of himself. The thing that does sort of lean me more towards overkill versus out of control are 2 different things for me. I felt like he really lost control. Like he got himself into a narrative that completely got out of control, especially with the leaving of that kind of evidence at the site. So I don't think so. I wonder even so much. I think it does have a sexual motivation angle that needs to be further, when he starts talking, and eventually he'll start talking.
I just have a lot of feelings about that. I think, because of his ego, 1,000%. He's sitting back and waiting to see who will come knocking to evaluate him or write a book or whatever. Right. My reaction that you saw on my face was because it's probably going to take an equally large ego for that person to be like, I want to be the one to write the book. And that's me talking about our peers. I think, honestly, we should let him sit behind bars and not give a shit about him anymore, which tugs at the piece of me and what we've talked about in this episode of like the need to study these things to keep the community safe in the future. But I agree with the judge who said we need to have Mr. Kohberger's 15 minutes of fame be done. But I'm sorry, there's going to be someone in our industry, in our field, that cannot wait to get in there.
Of course, sure. They're already writing letters to him right now. Yeah. And of course, there's been a lot of talk about Kohberger's efforts at dominating the conversation. But then again, this just gets sort of frittered down in media because, you see a headline of Kohberger attempted to dominate the conversation during his interrogation with cops. And then you realize that the person who's making the commentary was not one of the cops that was involved. It was somebody that was retired. And that's now what their job is. Their job is to be a talking head. And I'm one of those talking heads. You are one of those talking heads, right? So we're getting very meta here. And I agree that
Yeah, agreed.
there's a part of me that wants more information. And then part of it was like, are we really going to get anything of value from this person? I do think that it is fascinating. One of the interesting things that I think is important to look at is a share from one of the women that connected with him on a dating site and had the conversations with him via text as they're getting to know each other. And he just goes off the rail because he's like disinhibited because he's behind the screen of his phone or his computer. And he starts talking about like, first it's horror movies and then it's like crime and serial killers. And what do you think about this? Almost as if he was trying to find someone that was going to be his bridge to intimacy, was to find a woman who shared these things. I would not be so surprised if, and again, let's let him rot, but if it comes out that he was actually trying to find a partner to do these things with. I'm just going to say
That's an interesting hypothesis. So in terms of overkill, I think there's actually way more evidence for that than Piquerism so far.
Yeah.
Again, I think a lot about him is about power and control. You know, he was a very strict vegan for a long time. He lost a lot of weight. There's been a lot of areas with outliers like his heroin use where he has really tried to be in much control of himself. I think it is very rage based. I think there is betrayal, jealousy, all of those themes being taken out on these victims. And again, I also default back to what you're saying. Like, did he think just one person was going to be there who maybe he targeted and then there were four, right? Or he thought everyone would be asleep and now somebody is still awake. So could that play into how he then had to complete the crime rather than how he wanted to? I don't know. I think there's just, again, if we go back to the wounds as well, you know, we're talking 50 stab wounds with one victim. We're talking statements being made, like them being unrecognizable. That can certainly be overkill. Piquerism, I need to know more, right? Yeah. I'm not making that leap at this point.
Although I think that the knife held a lot of significance for him.
I do think so.
I don't think necessarily Piquerism, but there is something about that knife. I think that he fetishized that particular knife.
Yeah, I think you're right. You know, something else that I've kind of heard explored, or like if this was in fact a crime with some sexual undertones, is the type of quote unquote rough porn on his laptop. So the information that we have about that, which I thought was interesting and notable, but I want to also put that into context for people. There was non-consensual or coercive themes. So investigators found internet searches around the time of the murders that included some keywords like forced, drugged, passed out, sleeping, suggesting here, you know, some interest in non-consensual or unconscious victims. And then there was also some other visual content on his phone, which were images of women in bikinis like that he had taken, including photos of female students at Washington State University and the University of Idaho, I think. It's an interesting like voyeurism aspect there with that specifically. Definitely feels like there's this sort of like outside looking in theme to this guy, which again could promote the jealousy and that sort of thing. However, I will say those search terms on the computer, not uncommon for men to have those, not uncommon in regular non-deviant pornographic use, and not indicative of a sexually motivated crime taken alone, right?
Well,
I would need more.
I appreciate you saying that. I really appreciate you pointing that out, because several cases that I have been involved with accusations of terrible things, clearly guilty, some clearly not guilty. This is one of the things that prosecutors always want to go to.
Yeah.
And I'm always like sitting there rolling my eyes because I go, dude, give me your phone for 5 minutes. I'm going to find every single thing like this that you've been, let me look at your Instagram feed, you know, like who are you following? Like it's just another manifestation of Western American culture, puritanical view on sexuality, you know, and which only makes it worse when you like make it as something dark. That's why they don't have problems with porn in some areas of the world, is because they're very open and progressive about sexuality.
I'll point to one more piece of research, and you guys can Google this and it'll come up in, even like pop culture type articles. But the research consistently shows that when you look at people's like top 10 themes of porn that they go to for men, some sort of forced type of interaction is a very common fantasy or theme. And for women, being forced or having a non-consensual encounter is actually pretty high on a fantasy list. So again, these are just fantasies. This doesn't mean it's a paraphilic disorder. It doesn't mean it's causing them distress. It doesn't mean this is what they want in real life. This again, like I know I'm dipping my toe into something that is a way bigger conversation. A book that we've referenced a lot of times, A Billion Wicked Thoughts, is phenomenal in just like mathematicians breaking down the type of pornography that people consume is super, super interesting. But again, I will say alone, this does not make me say, oh my gosh, Koberger was absolutely sexually motivated because of the content on his phone or his computer.
So just quickly, folks, I know there's still a lot of talk about, does he fit the sort of profile of an incel? And look, as more info comes out, we can certainly look at the factors. Maybe there is something to look at that, but we don't have enough information or time today to analyze that. But we'll jump on a Patreon shrink wrap in the next month and a half or so as more information comes out. And I think there's going to be a lot more information that continues to come out about him. Certainly, you're hitting on those control issues with diet, and there's just a lot there that we can work with that's very interesting. Although, again, we don't want to give this person too much attention, but it is fascinating.
Sure. All right. So turning to our media entertainment portion here, there's many ways we can talk about this section. You have documentaries, some endless on some of these cases that we've talked about, like if we're talking about Whitechapel Murders. But then you also have the fictional slasher films, right? That by the very genre title could fit the bill here, but really nothing we could think of or find like truly fit Piquerism. It also feels a little weird after I just like gushed and recommended the Fear Street series last month when we were talking about Salem witch trials. But it was tough to find something that would be perfectly clued into our title today.
Well, interesting. There is a nexus between the concept of Piquerism and the Salem witch trials in that one of the defining evaluations for whether or not someone was a witch was to find a blemish on the skin, like a birthmark or a mole, and to prick it with a pin. And if they did not feel any pain, that was an indication that they were a witch. But of course, there were already bad actors at that time using collapsible needles. So it would be a handle with the needle on a spring, so any kind of pressure would make it go back. This is not so much entertainment, but this is media, and it unfortunately is largely forgotten. This is particularly I am interested in because my dissertation was on sexual practices during the age of HIV. I mean, I feel like today the age of HIV has been capped because there are really successful treatments for over 99% of the people who have been exposed to HIV. But for those of you who don't remember, if you're my age and you do remember, or you're younger, there was an absolute fear of getting pricked with bloody needles. And it was backed up by an actual safety risk. Like hospital and medical protocols changed very rapidly, and there was an absolute rise in blood exposure phobias that many clinicians had to treat. There were all these sort of sensationalistic stories about blood spattered razor blades being glued to the interior of payphone change returns, which I know is an archaic idea that there were payphones.
Oh my gosh.
But that you would get poked on a subway. And there were these reports that never really came to fruition about whether or not someone was exposed, but the fear was really there. And then, but back to media and your idea of slasher films, the movie Psycho, which is a wonderful classic horror movie, that
could work.
That would work as well.
If we hypothesize he was getting sexual gratification out of it, right?
Well,
yeah.
I think mommy just wanted him to do it.
Okay, maybe that's the case. I would recommend...
Mother, what have you done?
I would definitely recommend the Yorkshire Ripper documentary. It was excellent. It highlighted the outrage of the women in the community and how they empowered themselves during the hunt for the offender. This documentary came out in 2020 on Netflix, and it's just called The Ripper. It's a 4-part series.
Really, really good, especially focusing on how the Ripper used it as a way to sexually assault women by saying, oh, let me walk you home, be safe.
Ugh.
And then they took advantage of women. Just horrible. Now, there's also a documentary called Our Knife Crime Crisis, which is presented by Idris Elba and the BBC, that focuses solely on the rise of edged weapons attacks in the UK. It looks fantastic. Can't find a place to watch it yet. I'm sure it'll be released more broadly soon. That is a real phenomenon in the UK.
Yep.
Yeah.
It sure is. I could find the trailer, but I could not find the rest of the documentary as hard as I looked. All right. So as we finish up here, I do just want to give a shout out to the Eavesdroppin' podcast. They're out of the UK. So as part of, when I'm looking for quite a rare topic, sometimes what I will do is search the term. So in this case, I searched Piquerism in my podcast player, and they were literally the only show that came up as a result. They are this cheeky gossip pod with 2 girlfriends who cover weird shit, some true crime, just some generally fun stuff. So I reached out to them on social media and I was like, thank you for helping with our research. You were literally the only ones that came up when I looked at this. And I listened to their episode. They talked about some cases that had this. They talked a bit about the London Monster. So please go give them a listen. They're really fun and sweet. And they gave us a shout out after I had reached out to them.
Oh, cool. So, folks, here you go. Just 2 more Forensic Psych episodes to go before we close the doors on this particular venture of ours. We always leave a window open.
Yes,
you'll see us. We'll be answering emails. We'll be talking head interviews on shows and stuff. Our last live Behind the Couch featured a conversation we had with a detective who specializes in medical child abuse crimes. So please look for that in a couple of weeks. It's really, really good. And our final Behind the Couch will be on Saturday, August 30th with Dark City Podcasts. So please mark your calendars and come hang out with us for a live last show.
Oof. Yeah, the countdown's on.
It is.
All right, everyone. We will see you next time on LA
Not So
Confidential. Bye.
Bye, folks.
We sincerely thank you for spending some time with us today. LA Not So Confidential is part of Alienist Entertainment and the Crawl Space Media Network. Each episode is hosted, produced, and written by Dr. Scott and Dr. Shiloh. Our post-production editing and sweetening magic is handled by the multi-talented Jason Usry of Ear Cult Productions.
Our theme music, entitled Cool Vibes Film Noir, is composed and performed by the talented Kevin MacLeod. He graciously allows us to use his music via a Creative Commons Attribution license. Please check out all of Kevin's amazing work on YouTube.
All of the resources for each episode can be found on our website at www.la-not-so-confidential.com. You can find us on Blue Sky and Instagram at LA Not So Podcast. On TikTok, Facebook, and YouTube, we are at LA Not So Confidential. Media inquiries and bookings are scheduled at alienistentertainment@gmail.com.
Once a month, we go live on YouTube on a Saturday afternoon. So stay tuned to our social media announcements to join our interactive broadcast entitled Behind the Couch, where we interview guests on a number of psych, criminal justice, and true crime topics.
And lastly, we'd be honored if you joined our Patreon at patreon.com/LA Not So Podcast. With a subscription, you get an ad-free listening experience, additional content, host interaction, and you'll be the first to know about upcoming live events, social gatherings, and super cool merch.
So thanks for listening, and join us next time on LA
Not So
Confidential.